Tonight, we are walking into a part of the plains that does not feel empty for long. Open ground can look generous at first. Wide sky, low grass, room to breathe. But some landscapes only feel open until something large decides to move through them. A herd changing direction too suddenly. Brush bowing the wrong way. A carcass half dragged into the shade. The sense that if one heavy body is bad enough, several would be worse. Doshaguma is what happens when brute force stops being an individual trait and becomes a social strategy. Not social in the clean, orderly way people like to imagine pack animals either. Doshaguma are not elegant coursers, not long-distance coordinators, not the sort of predators that survive by timing, silence, or restraint. They are fanged beasts that are sometimes seen traveling in packs, ruggedly built, extremely aggressive, and known to haul prey back to their dens, where those hard-won carcasses can become the cause of fresh violence all over again. Even the official notes frame them less as disciplined cooperators and more as animals willing to throw everything they have at a problem, including their own bodies and, if necessary, other smaller creatures in the vicinity. At first glance, the body tells you almost everything. Doshaguma moves with a bear-like gait and carries itself like something that expects the world to give way before it. Its frame is deep through the chest and shoulder, its forelimbs thick and slightly armored, and its paws broad enough to function as both hammers and hooks. The pelt is heavy and golden brown, with longer, shaggier fur rising around the back of the skull and down the spine like a mane, while the face itself is strikingly bare, wrinkled, reddish, and furless. Small eyes sit in that exposed face, above upward jutting lower tusks and larger upper canines, giving the whole front of the skull an expression that looks permanently irritated. Alpha individuals are described as larger, redder in the face, and thicker through the mane, which immediately suggests visible hierarchy written directly into the body. There is also a structural detail worth pausing on. Doshaguma's upper back has a distinct hump, formed by the heavy muscles anchoring into the forequarters. That hump is not cosmetic bulk. It is leverage made visible. It tells you where the power lives. This is an animal built from the front backward, a body organized around what the forelimbs can do once contact happens. That body plan places Doshaguma in a very particular ecological category. It is not streamlined for pursuit. It is not built for stealth. It is built to close, withstand contact, and keep applying force after contact has already become ugly. Broad forequarters and dense musculature tell you this is an animal that solves problems by overpowering them at short range. The smaller eyes matter too. In open country, large eyes often belong to watchers and detectors. Doshaguma's eyes are comparatively tiny, which implies it does not depend heavily on precision vision at long range. It is the kind of predator that benefits more from confidence than caution, more from momentum than from fine targeting. That fits perfectly with its observed behavior: clawing, slamming, biting, charging with jaws wide open, and even hurling prey carcasses such as ceratonoth bodies as crude projectiles. If Quematrice reads like a scavenger that learned to bluff above its weight, Doshaguma reads like an animal that never learned the virtue of backing down. Public descriptions consistently stress territorial aggression, a wide habitat range, and a willingness to attack enemies head-on. Is even compared behaviorally to Odogaron, in the sense that it seems willing to fight regardless of the other monster's power, giving it what fans and wiki editors alike describe as a berserker mentality. That word is doing real work here, because Doshaguma's violence does not seem especially refined. It is not the violence of a specialist. It is the violence of something that has discovered repeatedly that many other animals fold when faced with unhesitating commitment. There is a cost to that commitment. Doshaguma are described as so densely muscled that when sufficiently enraged, their muscles can swell enough to tear open old wounds. That is one of the best details in the entire ecology, because it turns aggression into physiology. This is not simply an angry animal. This is an animal with a final, ugly reserve of force that pushes its own body past safety. The old scars matter then, not as decoration, not as history alone, as fault lines. When a weakened Doshaguma enters that brutal rage, it is not becoming cleaner or sharper. It is becoming more desperate and more dangerous at the same time. The body surges, the wounds reopen, and the species reveals what it has always been built around. Force first, consequences later. The fur helps explain how it gets that far in the first place. Descriptions of Doshaguma's coat suggest that its fur is so stiff and weathered by harsh climates that it functions almost like armor. That matters. The mane and dorsal coat do not simply make the animal look larger, though they absolutely do that. They also cushion glancing blows, weather, and abrasion. The forelimbs carry rougher, studded protection where impacts happen most often. But the protection is not uniform. The belly is weaker, softer, less well defended. And that is exactly what you would expect from a creature built around frontal violence. The front is protected because the front is what it commits. The underside remains the trade-off. The upright stance makes that trade-off visible. Doshaguma can rise onto its hind legs, exposing a softer belly but gaining height and visual dominance. In combat notes, that lifted posture is framed as both a threat display and a brief moment of vulnerability, since the stomach becomes a relatively soft target. That trade-off is deeply animal. A display that makes you look bigger often reveals something. The question is whether the display buys enough hesitation to be worth that risk. In Doshaguma's case, the answer seems to be yes. An animal this heavily committed to frontal violence benefits enormously from the first half second of intimidation, because once it has that half second, it is already in range to slam, bite, or seize. Its forelimbs deserve special attention because they are the true engines of the species. Descriptions emphasize armored forelegs and powerful paws, though not as heavily armored as Arzuros. That balance matters. Too much armor costs speed and flexibility. Too little leaves the limbs vulnerable during the constant high-impact striking Doshaguma performs. What we appear to get instead is a compromise. Enough protection to turn the forequarters into shock tools, but not so much that they stop being grasping, swiping, slamming limbs. This is consistent with an animal that grapples as much as it batters. The ability to pick up and throw prey carcasses also suggests a very high degree of forelimb strength and trunk stability, because lifting dead weight and redirecting it requires more than just brute pause. It requires coordinated power from shoulder, chest, spine, and hips. This is one reason Doshaguma packs are so dangerous to anything caught flat-footed. Group hunting in this species likely does not depend on precision role assignment so much as cumulative bodily pressure. One animal charges, another follows the stumble, a third arrives as the prey tries to reorient. In that sense, Doshaguma pack behavior may resemble mobbing more than elegant pack predation. That still counts as cooperation, but it is messy cooperation, opportunistic cooperation, the kind of collective violence that works precisely because each individual is already dangerous on its own. The comparisons people make to lions versus buffalo are rough, but they are not useless. The point is that once a large social carnivore gets enough bodies onto a struggling target, the problem becomes less, can we kill this? And more, can it recover its footing before the next impact? What makes Doshaguma especially interesting, though, is that this violence does not stay confined to the individual. Sometimes it becomes collective. Official descriptions and widely repeated field notes describe Doshaguma as sometimes traveling in packs, often structured around a single alpha with two subordinates, though larger story set groups have also been depicted. That immediately distinguishes them from most other large brutes in the region. Packs in Monster Hunter are rare enough to matter, and Doshagumas are especially notable because the subordinate members are not tiny support animals. They are themselves large monsters. But this is where the species gets subtle, because pack does not necessarily mean wolf. Everything we have suggests that Doshaguma pack behavior is comparatively loose. Even the fandom ecology sections note that the group is not especially cohesive and may function less like a tightly coordinated hunting machine and more like a cluster of violent opportunists sticking together because each member gains a better chance at a free meal. There is a real-world parallel here, and it is not canids. It is much closer to the rougher edge of social carnivory, seen in animals like hyenas, lions, or even some bears gathered at concentrated food sources where cooperation and competition overlap instead of replacing each other. That overlap is the key to understanding Doshaguma hierarchy. A true, highly social pack predator usually has strong pressure toward role clarity because each individual's success depends on the group functioning cleanly. Doshaguma do not seem to operate like that. Their packs look more like unstable alliances held together by the advantages of shared intimidation and group feeding. The alpha is larger and visibly more developed, but the official description that prey taken back to dens can lead to violent disputes strongly implies that dominance does not erase internal competition. It merely contains it. The pack is useful when there is something large to kill or defend. Once the carcass is secured, the old question returns: who eats first and how much? That is not a wolf problem. That is a lion problem. That is a hyena problem. That is the problem of social predators whose relationships are built on both cooperation and constant rank testing. The alpha itself is especially revealing. What is interesting is that the alpha does not reinvent the species. It is not a radically different creature with some new silhouette or strange special anatomy. It simply looks like the same design pushed farther, a little larger, a little redder, a little heavier through the mane and shoulders, a little more convincing. In a way, that subtlety makes the hierarchy feel more believable. The alpha does not need exotic anatomy to lead. It only needs to look like the version of Doshaguma most other Doshaguma would rather not argue with. The larger frame, brighter red face, and thicker reddish mane strongly suggest that status is not invisible within the species. The head and neck region in particular likely function as both protection and display. A thicker mane makes biting the neck harder. A more vivid face and more prominent mass around the head make the animal look bigger during threat postures, especially when standing upright and roaring. In many real mammals, visible thickening around the head and shoulders signals condition, maturity, and fighting ability all at once. Doshaguma seems to fit that logic almost too neatly. There is another layer worth adding here. Females are described as considerably smaller than males, and they lack both the large mane and the muscular hump. That tells you something important about what the most iconic Doshaguma silhouette really is. It is not just species form. It is sexed and statist. The hulking, mane-heavy, humpbacked brute people picture first is likely the most socially aggressive expression of the species, not its only form. That helps make the alpha even easier to read. It is not special because it becomes something else. It is special because it is more of what already matters. A Doshaguma pack in motion likely does not look military. It looks heavy. Not a line of perfect spacing, not a formation in the wolfish sense, but a loose cluster of bodies moving with the same broad intention. The alpha goes first often enough that the others can read the decision from its posture alone. A head lowers, a shoulder rolls forward. The pace changes by half a step, and that is usually enough. The followers do not need commands in any refined sense. They only need to see which way confidence is flowing. One drifts wider through the grass, another lingers a little closer to the carcass trail or the herd edge. A third keeps enough distance to avoid a sudden correction from the larger body ahead, but not so much distance that it loses the advantage of moving inside that pressure field. That is what makes the pack feel ominous, even before it attacks. Open land stops feeling open once several heavy animals begin to share momentum. The space in front of them narrows. The routes off to the side look less reliable. And even if the subordinates are not perfectly coordinated, they do not need to be. Their very presence changes how everything else measures escape. A lone Doshaguma is a problem. A moving group of them is a shape the landscape has to react to. Now, one of the most useful details in the ecology is not actually about fighting. It is about where and when the species chooses company at all. Doshaguma are typically found in the scarlet forest, but may roam into the Windward Plains in search of food, especially when in a pack. That distinction matters. If they are more often solitary in the scarlet forest and more often grouped in the plains, then the pack is not simply the default social state. It is an ecological response. The open ground of the plains rewards intimidation differently. Prey is more exposed. Carcasses are easier to see. Large herd animals are easier to harry collectively. A broad open landscape also makes visible confidence more valuable. One heavy animal is a threat. 3 heavy animals moving together can clear space before contact even happens. And for the herbivores of the plains, that pressure is not only physical, it is behavioral. A herd survives on warning time. Heads lift early, bodies bunch. The safest option is usually to move before contact ever happens. But Doshaguma complicates that logic, because a pack does not need to run a perfect chase to be effective. It only needs to get close enough, often enough, that the herd's calm breaks in the wrong direction. That is where brute force becomes ecological influence. A Keratanoth herd that would normally cross open ground in a broad, confident line may compress too early when several Doshaguma appear together. A Dolthodon group may burn energy on a false retreat, simply because the pack looks committed before it actually is. Once prey starts moving badly, once spacing collapses or footing gets messy, or one animal turns half a second late, the heavy predator does not need elegance anymore. It only needs the first mistake. That likely means Doshaguma shapes more than individual kills. It shapes route choice. It shapes alertness. It shapes when a herd decides that a stretch of open land is still worth crossing. And in a place like the Windward Plains, that kind of pressure matters almost as much as the bite itself. The scarlet forest, by contrast, may not reward that same arrangement as consistently. Sightlines are shorter. Terrain is denser. Ambush opportunities differ. Solitary strength may be enough more often there, and the costs of constant proximity may outweigh the benefits. That makes Doshaguma feel less like a pack species in the romantic sense, and more like a species that becomes social when the environment makes temporary alliance worth the trouble. The denning behavior is another major clue. Taking prey back to dens is a fundamentally different ecological choice than consuming everything at the kill site. It suggests several things at once. First, that Doshaguma can physically move meaningful mass. Second, that kills are worth defending in a home space, even if transport costs energy. Third, that den sites themselves matter enough to be repeated centers of activity. But the note that this behavior sometimes leads to violent disputes is the most interesting part. It implies that the den is not a peaceful family table. It is a resource node. Bring enough meat into a constrained space, and rank tension rises. That immediately evokes species where feeding order and physical proximity create flashpoints. Again, not wolves. More like the uglier side of large social mammals built on dominance and opportunism. And this is where the script gets sleepier, because you can imagine the scene between hunts. A den after a kill is not quiet, not really, not peaceful either. One animal lies close to the carcass and breathes hard through a blood-slick muzzle. Another circles, wanting closer access, but not wanting the first hit that would come from pushing too soon. A subordinate watches the alpha before it watches the food. Someone growls low. Someone shifts. A paw lands a little too hard. A lip pulls back. No full fight yet. Just the unstable calm of large predators pretending tolerance because there is enough meat for the moment. That kind of half-peace may be just as important to the species as the violence itself. It also lets us make sense of the body's overall balance between fur, armor, and exposed skin. The thick fur along the head, spine, and tail likely does several jobs at once. It makes the animal look larger from a distance. It protects vulnerable areas from glancing bites and blows. It may help absorb some weather stress, especially in environments where cold rain, wind, and seasonal shifts matter. Armor on the forelimbs protects the striking surfaces. The bare, wrinkled face is more curious. Exposed facial skin in mammals often correlates with display, thermoregulation, or tissue that experiences frequent wear and therefore benefits from not trapping debris. In Doshaguma, the red exposed face likely serves a display function at minimum, especially given that alphas become even redder and more conspicuous. But it may also simply be a practical solution for a creature that bites, bellows, and takes impacts to the front of the head often enough that fur there would become filthy or torn away. What about fear? What scares a Doshaguma? This matters because animals that live by aggression still need limits. Community discussion around Doshaguma repeatedly notes that they recognize stronger predators and can be deterred by cues associated with them, even if a strong alpha makes the group bolder. In other words, the pack increases courage, but it does not erase self-preservation. This is exactly what you would expect from a species whose sociality is unstable. A truly self-sacrificing pack species can commit beyond individual caution. Doshaguma seem more selfish than that. The group gives them leverage, but each animal still carries its own threshold for danger. That also means the alpha's job may be less about perfect command and more about pushing the group's risk tolerance upward through visible confidence and forward movement. That distinction is important when comparing Doshaguma to real-world pack hunters. Wolves are often overused as the pack analogy for any social predator, but Doshaguma do not read as wolves at all. Wolves are built for coordinated pursuit and endurance. Doshaguma are built for impact, intimidation, and short-range overmatch. Spotted hyenas are a better comparison in one respect. They are socially complex, physically powerful, and capable of both cooperation and vicious internal competition. Lions are another good comparison in terms of carcass disputes, visual dominance, and the way multiple heavy predators can bring down prey larger than any one of them might comfortably tackle alone. Yet Doshaguma still differs from both. It is less cleanly cooperative than wolves, less socially codified than lions, and possibly less stable than hyenas. What it offers instead is a kind of brutal, temporary alliance, one that seems to form most strongly when an alpha is present and when the reward is worth the hassle. This is why the body and the social system fit each other so well. Doshaguma does not need delicate coordination because the body itself is already a solution. Every individual is a battering ram. Add 2 more battering rams, and the pack tactic can be relatively simple. Stay near the alpha, rush with it, keep something from standing back up. That is enough to produce a species that becomes dramatically more dangerous in a group, even if the group is not particularly graceful. It also explains why players and observers alike experience Doshaguma packs as overwhelming rather than clever. Their threat comes from pressure stacking, not from trickery. And in the day-to-day life of the plains, that matters, because the animal does not have to be graceful to be felt. A route changes because there are prints where there were not prints yesterday. A carcass vanishes from open ground because something broad-shouldered dragged it away. The grass lies flat in a line that looks less like travel and more like insistence. A herd lifts its heads all at once. The open land stops feeling open. In the end, the most convincing way to understand Doshaguma is not as a single monster with backup, but as a species sitting on the edge between solitary brutality and true pack predation. Its body is still the body of an individual fighter. Thick forequarters, tusked jaws, armored striking limbs, mane-heavy threat silhouette, enough raw strength to throw prey, and enough stubbornness to attack things stronger than itself. But under the right conditions, especially when a larger alpha is present, those individuals aggregate into something more dangerous than the sum of their parts. Not because they become sophisticated, because they become emboldened, because they can create feeding opportunities they could not create alone. Because once one animal commits, the others gain a cheap chance at the same meal. That makes Doshaguma one of the more believable kinds of social carnivore. Not the fantasy of perfect teamwork, but the uglier, more plausible truth that violence often scales before intelligence does. A Doshaguma pack is not frightening because it is elegant. It is frightening because it is enough. And when the grass finally stills again, and whatever was dragged toward the den is out of sight, the plains do not feel quiet so much as temporarily spared. Let them keep moving somewhere over the next rise. Let the den stay far from your path. And let the heavy shapes in the grass remain only shapes tonight. Good night, hunter.